The chamber was too large for any human measure, built for a dream of empire that had never learned the word enough. Vaults climbed into shadow until they became rumor. The stone drank light. The metal ate sound. There was always noise. Fans that could have breathed for cities, chains that held up catwalks, the click of servo skulls roaming like flies. But the noise was the kind that made the mind feel alone, as if all the world had retreated behind a door and left you outside to listen. Upon the golden throne, the emperor did not move. He had not moved in 10,000 years, if movement was measured by muscle and bone. The machine held what remained of flesh in a cradle of adamantium and arcane alloys, and it held the rest, something bright and unbearable, like a fist around a star. Tubes ran into him. Cabling thicker than a man's torso fed him. Sigils were carved so deep into the throne struts they looked like wounds in the metal itself. The Custodes did not look at him for long. Even they, made to endure what would peel other souls like fruit, kept their eyes disciplined. They watched the room. They listened for the smallest betrayal, a misaligned boot on marble, a deviant hum from a generator, a prayer spoken with the wrong emphasis. On a lower gantry, a line of psyker acolytes knelt with heads bowed, hands bound in chains inscribed with warding scripts. Their lips moved. Their teeth chattered. Some wept without sound, tears threading down cheeks already salted raw dotty. Around them, tech priests in black and iron murmured Benharic hymns, their voices like insects in a jar. A thin-boned woman in a simple gray robe moved among the psychers, touching foreheads, checking pupils, measuring tremors. She never spoke. Her presence made the air feel clearer and colder, as if the room's rot had been cut away with a blade. A sister of silence, one of the few things in all the Imperium that could walk near the throne and not be consumed by what lived in the unseen. And above it all, constant as gravity, was the ache of the Emperor's fractured will, a pressure that turned thought into effort. Those who could sense it described it differently, some as a choir screaming in a cathedral of glass, some as a storm pinned behind the eyes, some as the distant drag of a chain around the throat. But it was always present, always incomplete, always braced against annihilation. Tonight, the pressure changed. It did not flare. It did not swell. It did not announce itself with a miracle that would make men fall to their knees and call it grace. It tightened, like a scattered army receiving its first command. The psychers' trembling shifted. Their muttering stumbled, then found a shared rhythm. A tech priest's incantation caught in his throat, not from error but from a sudden impossible alignment in the machine song. The Sister of Silence paused mid-step, her pale fingers hovering over a boy's brow. Even the servo skulls faltered in their flight, drifting as if the air had thickened. A custodian, Helmon, spear grounded, felt it through the soles of his feet. The vibration in the throne structure changed frequency by a fraction, as if a choir had tuned itself from agony into purpose. The ancient machine did not become quiet. It became precise. Somewhere deep inside the throne, beyond material and code and ritual, the Emperor's presence stopped being 1,000 shards pressing against a window. It became a single hand laid flat. The boy beneath the sister's fingers inhaled, long and ragged, and did not scream. His eyes, wide as coins, focused for the first time since he had been brought here. The sister withdrew her hand. For a breath, she looked up toward the throne. In that gesture, so small, so human, there was something like fear, not of death, but of meaning. The throne's great conduits throbbed once, not like a heart, like a lock turning. And in the shadowed heights of Terra's palace, in a place where prayer had been hammered into architecture until it became indistinguishable from law, the Emperor woke, not into flesh, but into himself. Far from Terra, in the belly of an ancient warship that smelled of oil, incense, and old blood, Roboute Guilliman stood with both hands braced on the edge of a strategium dais, and stared at a starfield that did not exist. The map was a projected lie. Glowing lines, drifting icons, root threads pinned through a galaxy that had learned to tear itself in half. The cicatrix maledictum cut the chart like a wound that refused to clot. Across it, the Indomitus Crusade crawled, a procession of fleets and armies, and freshly made warriors built to plug a breach in reality with bodies and prayer. Roboute's face was still, carved into calm by long discipline. The light from the hololith painted him in cold blues, making the scars on his cheeks look like old seams. Around him stood admirals with tired eyes, generals with medallions heavy enough to crush ribs, and space marines in armor that made them towers among mortals. The ship's chapel bells rang somewhere far down a corridor, and the sound threaded through the strategium like a reminder that men had always needed something above them when the world fell away. A robed astropath stumbled, catching himself on a brass rail. His blind eyes were wet. His mouth worked soundlessly, like a man trying to speak through deep water. "Report," Roboute said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The astropath's head snapped up as if yanked by a hook. "My lord," he rasped. The light, the beacon." A navigator, face half hidden behind a veil of black mesh, stiffened in the shadows. The attendant at the navigator's side, thin, pale, a bundle of nerves and perfume, pressed a hand to her own throat as if to stop a scream from escaping. The hololith flickered. For an instant, the star map blurred into something else, a white, vertical glare that made every icon look like ash. The glare vanished as quickly as it came, leaving behind the same roots, the same distant wars, the same madness. But everyone in the room had felt it. It was like walking in a blizzard for weeks and, without warning, stepping into a windless courtyard. Not warmer, not kinder, just coherent. Roboute's chest tightened. He had lived for centuries in an age when the Emperor was a story told by broken men. Then he had returned to a galaxy that worshipped that story as if it were air. Then he had stood before the throne and heard a voice that was not a voice, fragmented into shards that cut more than they explained. This felt different. A flutter moved through the strategium's mortal officers, fear disguised as procedure. They looked to Roboute the way peasants once looked to lords on castle walls, hoping for certainty, fearing what certainty would cost. The astropath's lips peeled back from his teeth. "It is not brighter," he said, and a strange grief threaded his words. "It is cleaner. It is, Emperor preserve me, it is like he is looking." Yeah. Roboute held himself very still. Around him, the ship's systems continued their steady labor. The hololith steadied. The Crusade's routes lay open again. Yet the air tasted different, like the moment before thunder breaks. Roboute turned his head slightly toward the Navigator's shadowed corner. "Can you take us through?" he asked. The veiled figure's gloved hand rose, trembling once before it steadied. "Yes," the Navigator whispered. "Yes, Lord Regent. The sea is arranged?" Arranged. No navigator used that word. Roboute felt, in the deepest place he kept his doubts, a memory of the throne room's pressure. He felt it again now, not crushing and formless, but shaped like intent. For the first time since his resurrection, Roboute wondered if the Emperor's silence had not been death. It had been preparation. Elira Noctis had learned as a child that the warp did not hate you. Hatred implied focus. The warp was a sea that boiled with every emotion a species could vomit into it. Rage, hunger, love, despair, until the mixture became something that could mimic gods. It killed you the way a storm killed you, without malice, but with pleasure, if you gave it reason. In the Navigatorium, the air was salted and sacred. The walls were etched with warding runes so deep they seemed to have been carved by fingernails. Candles burned in niches where ancient saints stared with hollow eyes. Elira stood at the center, her silk veil fluttering like a nervous animal. Her third eye was covered, yet she felt it itching beneath the fabric, eager to open and drown in impossible horizons. She had taken fleets through nightmare before. She had threaded ships past shrieking shoals and the teeth of predators that wore the faces of dead friends. She had done it because she was born for it, because her bloodline was a key the Imperium could not afford to lose, and because fear had never paid her wages. Tonight, she drew breath and reached. The warp pressed against her mind with familiar filth. It reeked of sweet rot. It tasted of copper. The ship's Gellerfield was a shell around a candle in a hurricane, and she was the woman asked to carry that candle across a bridge made of screams. She opened her third eye. The Astronomican blazed in the distance. Always a lighthouse, always the single, unwavering wound of light in the storm. Elira had thought she understood it. She had thought it constant because it had to be. Now it looked intentional. The light did not simply exist. It observed. Not with warmth, not with mercy, but with a steady, indifferent clarity that made the warp's froth recoil. The tides around the beacon shifted into patterns that felt like mathematics rather than appetite. Elira swayed. Her attendants tightened the silver chains around her wrists, not to restrain her, but to anchor her to the real. One murmured prayers. Another whispered her name like a lover trying to keep someone from walking into the sea. The warp's inhabitants noticed too. Something large, something hunched and pleased, had been gliding toward the ship's path, a shadow with too many mouths, amused by the taste of human terror. It slowed. It tilted, as if listening. And then, as the beacon's clean radiance touched it, the thing recoiled with a sound Elira heard inside her teeth. It did not burn like fire. It unraveled like a lie exposed to daylight. Elira's throat tightened until she could barely breathe. She had never seen the Astronomican do that. Not like this. Not without the warp howling back in triumph. She forced herself to look again, deeper into the heart of the light. There was a presence within it, vast as empire and old as betrayal. She had felt it before in whispers, in the pressure behind prayer, in the way soldiers clutched relics when they bled out. But this was not a distant idol. This was a will. Elira's voice came out cracked. "He is awake," she whispered, and the words tasted like blasphemy and relief and terror all at once. Behind her veil, her attendants flinched, as if the sound might summon punishment. Elira stared into the storm and saw the roots straighten. The sea was being told what to do. On Terra, Trajann Valoris walked a corridor that had once been a mountain. The Imperial Palace was not a building. It was a continent of stone and steel, layered over itself with 10,000 years of fear. The corridors changed as you walked them. Not physically, but in the way the mind tried to hold their scale and failed. A hall might be long enough for a regiment to march in formation and still not reach the end. A doorway might be tall enough to admit a titan, yet sealed with a lock no mortal hand could turn. Trajann moved with measured certainty, a sun-colored figure in an ocean of shadow. His armor caught torchlight and broke it into warm shards. The red plume of his helm swayed with his stride like a banner that did not need wind. Custodians followed at distance, not because he required protection, but because the palace itself was a battlefield, and every corner could hide a betrayal older than most worlds. He had spent decades, centuries, listening for change. The Custodes did not sleep the way other men slept. Their rest was vigilant, their dreams trimmed into tools. Trajann's life was the keeping of a single truth: the Emperor must endure. Everything else, high lords, wars, faith, was secondary. Sometimes inconvenient, sometimes useful, always expendable. Tonight, he felt the palace inhale. It was not a sound. It was a shift in the air that made the hairs on his arms tighten beneath armor seals. The hum of generators adjusted pitch. Distant chanting, a constant from shrines that never ceased, faltered as if thousands of throats had forgotten the next line. Trajann paused before a set of doors carved with the histories of the Unification Wars. The relief showed old enemies, war tyrants in masks, gene witches with serpents for spines, kings with crowns made of bones. The carvings had been polished by time and touch until the faces looked almost alive. A sister of silence stood by the doors, hands folded, gaze fixed on nothing. Her presence made the corridor feel stripped. Trajann watched her for a beat. The sisters were not his order, but they were as close to allies as anyone could be when your master's existence threatened the universe. The sister lifted her chin just slightly. Her eyes widened, not in panic, in recognition. Trajann turned his gaze toward the doors and felt it. The Emperor's presence, which had been a distant pressure like a storm behind a wall, tightened into a line. In the first instant, Trajann's mind did what it had been trained never to do. It reached for emotion. Awe, relief, fear. The old human instincts, buried beneath perfection, stirred like animals in a cage. He crushed them. Then the command came. Not a vision. Not a dream. Not a riddle whispered through half-mad prophets. A directive? Clear as steel. Open die. Attend. Execute. Trajann's heart, engineered to be steady in all things, hitched once, a single betrayed beat. He bowed his head, not in worship, but in acknowledgement. The doors began to move without any hand touching them. Ancient mechanisms groaned, and for a heartbeat, the palace sounded old, truly old, as if the age of it had finally been allowed to speak. Trajann stepped forward. The Emperor was not rising from the throne, but the throne was no longer holding a corpse. It was holding a commander. Belisarius Cawl listened to the galaxy the way other men listened to music. He did not hear it with ears, not truly. Most of those had been replaced more than once across a lifespan he liked to pretend was a single continuous thread. He heard it in the tremor of machine spirits when a cogitator was asked to do the impossible. He heard it in the faint shiver of a plasma coil when warp storms snarled too close. He heard it in the way 1,000 little systems, each convinced they were sovereign, aligned or rebelled when something greater shifted. In his forge shrine aboard the Crusade fleet, red-robed adepts tended incense braziers as if smoke could soothe circuitry. Candles guttered in iron cages, their flames reflected in brass skulls and polished lenses. The floor was a mosaic of sacred geometry, laid down in a pattern that made sense only if you believed reality could be persuaded by symmetry. Belisarius stood at a lectern of black metal, its surface crawling with shifting data runes. His many limbs hovered over the stream, some flesh, some mechadendrite, some something in between. A servo skull drifted at his shoulder, bearing a parchment strip that listed prayers in neat high Gothic. It murmured them in a voice made from stolen choir boys. He should have been pleased. The Indomitus Crusade was his triumph as much as anyone's, the seal on his audacity, the proof that his centuries of forbidden labor had not been wasted. Primarchin, as the old genealogies might have called them, marched in newly forged armor, bearing gene lines that would have made lesser magi froth in terror. Ships moved. Armies held. And yet, the data stream stuttered, not from fault, but from an intrusion that did not behave like intrusion. A new signal threaded through the ship's noosphere, bypassing wards without tripping them, sliding past rites of authentication like a hand through smoke. Belisarius froze, something almost human in the way his augmetic fingers held still. A junior adept gasped and clutched her cogitator's slate as if it had become hot. "Archmagos," she whispered. "The beacon, the Astronomican." Belisarius had no patience for superstition, not in its crude form. He respected faith as a tool. He despised it as a substitute for thought. Yet he felt it too. The shift in the warp pressure against the ship's hull. The sudden smoothing of turbulence that should not smooth. Then the new spheric intrusion resolved into clarity. It was not a message. It was a presence in code. A command dressed in machine logic so perfect it made his own best work feel like childish scratches. It did not announce itself as the Emperor. It did not need to. There was only one mind in the Imperium that could speak through reality like that, and make even machine spirits go still. Belisarius' lenses narrowed, clicking. "Interesting," he said softly, though the word was a lie. His internal processes churned in a frenzy hidden behind calm. The data runes on the lectern rearranged themselves into a pattern he recognized from ancient schematics of the Golden Throne. Patterns he had studied in secret. Patterns no one was meant to interpret unless they were willing to die for understanding. A command pulsed through the stream. Regulate. Stabilize. Excise noise. Belisarius' breath caught. Half laugh, half shiver. "So," he murmured, and the adepts around him looked up as if a god had spoken. In a way, one had. Belisarius reached out, not with hands but with mind, brushing the edge of the command like a scholar touching forbidden scripture. The response came instantly, a pressure that was not threat but limit, as if the presence had glanced at him and decided in an instant exactly how much truth he could be permitted without breaking. For a fraction of a second, Belisarius saw shapes behind the veil of ignorance. SC logic lines, the elegant bones of lost technologies, the shadow of a dragon curled beneath Mars myths. Then the glimpse vanished, leaving him hungry and smiling. The candles in the forge shrine flared in unison, as if a wind had passed through sealed air. Belisarius inclined his head not in worship but in calculation. If the Emperor was awake, then the age of improvisation was ending. And Belisarius Cawl had always preferred plans. Roboute dismissed the officers with gestures that were polite only because he made them so. The strategium emptied in disciplined silence, boots ringing on metal decks, murmured orders fading into corridors. When the doors sealed, the room felt suddenly smaller, as if the ship itself leaned in to listen. He walked without haste to his private chamber, a space that had been a chapel once, and now served as a place where a resurrected warlord could pretend to be alone. The walls were hung with old banners, Ultramar's sigils, the Aquila, the marks of crusades that had ended before the Imperium learned to call every war eternal. A small icon of the Emperor stood on a shelf, carved from dark wood and polished by countless hands. Roboute had never asked for it. Someone had placed it there as naturally as placing a knife near a sleeping lord. An astropath waited, kneeling on a woven prayer rug. Dried blood crusted his nostrils. His blind eyes were rolled upward beneath scarred lids. He trembled like a man holding a live wire. Roboute stood over him and felt a familiar bitterness. He had once led armies with clear supply lines, clear command structures, clear reasons. Now he led men who bled from their brains because the Imperium used human minds as radios. "Speak," Roboute said. The astropath swallowed. "It comes," he whispered. "It comes like ice." Roboute's jaw tightened. "From Terra." The astropath nodded, a jerky movement. Not from Terra. From him." Roboute did not correct the pronoun. In this age, the Emperor was not a man to most. He was a weather system, a law of nature, a god. Roboute stared at the wooden icon on the shelf. The carved face was serene, almost kind. Whoever had made it had never stood in the throne room. "Deliver it," Roboute said. The astropath's back arched. A sound escaped him, a choking exhale that was not quite a scream. The chamber's candles shuddered, flames bending toward the astropath as if drawn by breath. Roboute felt it then, the pressure behind thought, the colossal weight of attention. It slid into the room, and the ship around them seemed to hush, as if even machine spirits had learned reverence. A voice formed in Roboute's mind. Not words, not at first. A structure. A map. A chain of logic so perfect it made his own discipline feel like instinct. Then, language, cold, careful, stripped of comfort. Roboute Guilliman. The name hit like a hand closing around his throat. He had heard it before in that broken communion, fractured into meanings that contradicted themselves. This time, it was singular. "You are out of position." Roboute's eyes narrowed. The words were not accusation. They were assessment, like a surgeon noting a misaligned bone. "I am where the Imperium needs me," Roboute said aloud, and hated himself for the defensiveness in it. For a heartbeat, the presence did not respond. Roboute felt, impossibly, the sense of something turning to look at him with all of the weight of history behind it. "The Imperium is what remains, not what is needed." Roboute's breath left him. The contempt was not emotional. It was factual, like gravity. Then came the command. Stabilize the species. Consolidate logistics. End redundancy. Reduce superstition where it impedes function. Preserve it where it binds morale. Roboute's hands curled into fists. "You speak of superstition," he said, and the chamber seemed to tighten around the word. "They worship you." A pause. "Worship is a mechanism. It is not truth." Roboute felt the old rage rise, the outrage of a son who had been told once that reason would guide them. "You are their emperor," he said, "not their god." A sharper pressure, like the edge of a blade laid against his mind. "I am what humanity made when it decided to survive." The statement was so vast, so stripped of pity, that for a moment Roboute could not breathe. His eyes flicked to the great rift map on the wall. The galaxy cut open, bleeding madness. He thought of worlds he had never seen, screaming behind warp storms. He thought of children born into cults and conscription and hunger. He heard the next line not as condemnation, but as the end of an argument he had been having with himself since his return. "You were not made to rule. You were made to hold." Roboute's throat worked. "Hold what?" he whispered. "Hold long enough for me to act." The presence receded slightly, not leaving but settling into the background like a storm choosing to wait beyond the horizon. Roboute looked down at the astropath. The man had gone limp, his body sagging. Blood ran anew from his nose. Yet he was alive, breathing, faint, but alive. Roboute had seen astropaths die from messages with less weight. He looked again at the wooden icon, and felt something he could not name. Not faith, not comfort. A dread that tasted like clarity. Trajann stood in a room that had never been used by anyone outside his order. The auditorium was small by palace standards, which meant it could have held a cathedral. Statues lined the walls, primarchs in idealized forms, their faces stern and too handsome. Their armor carved with such attention that every rivet looked like it could cut skin. Tapestries hung between them, depicting the Great Crusade in woven gold and black. Heroes reduced to thread. A stone table sat at the center, bare except for a floating sigil of the Aquila projected above it. The sigil's wings shifted slightly as if breathing, an old piece of technology dressed in ritual. Custodians stood around the table, helms removed. Their faces were not identical, but they shared the same expression, a calm that had been forged into them as a weapon. Trajann had served through 10,000 years of decay. He had watched high lords scheme like petty lords in a crumbling keep. He had watched the Ecclesiarchy build a religion around a man who had hated religion. He had watched the Inquisition gnaw at the Imperium's own bones in the name of purity. He had watched it all without intervening because his duty was not to fix the Imperium. His duty was to guard the Emperor. That duty had just changed, and the shift was like the ground moving beneath a city. The command that had come from the throne was not ambiguous. Audit. Dot. Excise. Preserve. Trajann looked at his warriors. "We have been statues," he said. His voice was quiet, and that made it more dangerous. "We will be knives." No one flinched. No one questioned. The Custodes did not argue. They refined. A custodian named Ammon, a giant of a man whose eyes had once watched the walls of the throne room without blinking for a decade, inclined his head. "Targets." Trajann lifted a hand, and the Aquila sigil melted into a spread of data runes. Names appeared. Offices, not people. Institutions. The words that had governed the Imperium since the Heresy. Ecclesiarchy. Administratum. Astra Telepathica. Inquisition. Trajann's jaw tightened at the last. Not fear. Irritation. The Inquisition had always been a question mark carved into law, a necessary poison. The Emperor has issued operational directives, Trajann said. He still could not quite say it without tasting the absurdity. The Emperor had always been a presence. Now he was a commander again, and the galaxy would not survive the adjustment without bleeding. Amon studied the runes. This will be seen as a coup. It will be seen as obedience, Trajann replied. We do not seize power. We remove obstacles. Another custodian, younger by Custodes' measure, which meant he had only spent 2 centuries watching the palace rot, spoke carefully. The High Lords will resist. Trajann's eyes moved to the statues on the walls, the carved primarchs staring down with eternal authority. Let them, he said. Resistance clarifies what is diseased. He reached into the data stream and selected the first node, a vault beneath the Basilica of St. Helix, rumored to contain relics, confessions, and the sort of secrets that allowed priests to blackmail planets. The Emperor's command did not specify blood. It did not specify mercy either. Trajann dismissed the projection with a flick of his hand. The Aquila returned, hovering above stone like a judge. We move in silence, he said. We do not announce. We do not preach. We do not become symbols for others to kneel to. Amon's mouth twitched at that, not quite a smile. We are symbols regardless. Trajann's gaze hardened. Then we will be symbols of function, he said. Not of myth. As he spoke, he felt again the new pressure in the palace. The Emperor's will, steady and sharp, watching like a blade laid across a throat. For 10,000 years, Trajann had guarded a throne. Now he was being told to guard a species. Cardinal Cithrin had always believed in the power of a closed door. He sat in a private office tucked behind the Basilica's grand sanctum, a room so stuffed with relics it looked less like a place of work, and more like a hoarder's shrine. Bones in crystal cases. Splinters of wood claimed to be from a saint's pyre. A bolt round engraved with the name of a martyr who had died smiling. Scrolls stacked like bricks, sealed with wax and authority. His chair was carved from blackwood and inlaid with gold filigree. It made him feel like a king, which was useful, because the Ecclesiarchy survived on convincing men they were small, and then offering them a way to feel tall again. Tonight, his fingers trembled. A sealed scroll lay on his desk. The wax was not ecclesiarchal red. It was not the blue of the administratum. It was not the black of the Inquisition. It was plain, uncolored, the seal stamped with a simple aquila that looked almost old-fashioned, almost honest. Cithrin's lips moved in prayer, but the words tasted like dust. He had received messages from Terra before, instructions to change a litany, to condemn a sector, to bless a crusade. This scroll had arrived without courier, without announcement. It had simply been on his desk when he turned from his shrine wall, as if reality had decided to place it there. He reached for it, then hesitated. The door behind him opened without knock. Cithrin's breath caught. He had locked that door himself, with a key worn smooth from use. The lock clicked, defeated by something that did not respect keys. Heavy footsteps entered. Not the soft tread of priests. Not the measured scrape of guardsmen. These were steps that belonged to men who had never feared consequence. Cithrin turned slowly. 2 Adeptus Custodes filled the doorway, their armor dull gold in candlelight, their spears held upright with ritual grace. Their helms were on, their faces hidden. Yet Cithrin felt their attention like the point of a blade. Between them stood a figure in gray, one of the Silent Sisters, her expression empty as stone. Cithrin's mouth went dry. Honored lords, he managed. To what do I owe? The custodian on the left raised a hand. The gesture was small, yet it silenced the room as effectively as a shout. The air seemed to tighten. Even the candle's flames leaned away. You have received a directive, the custodian said. His voice was deep, resonant, without threat because he did not require it. Cithrin licked his lips. From Terra. From the throne, the custodian corrected. The words dropped into Cithrin's stomach like ice. From the throne meant the Emperor. The Emperor, who was supposed to be a distant god corpse, propping up a religion with his suffering. The Emperor, who did not issue directives. The Emperor, who endured. Cithrin's hand hovered over the scroll. May I know the contents? The custodian tilted his helm by the barest fraction. You will open it, he said. You will comply. Cithrin's throat tightened. And if the directive contradicts doctrine? The silent sister's eyes flicked to him then, and in that look he felt the emptiness she carried, a void that could swallow prayer. It made his soul feel exposed. The custodian's voice remained level. Doctrine is what endures when the Emperor is silent, he said. He is not silent. Cithrin's fingers broke the seal. The parchment unrolled on its own, as if eager. The script was crisp, black, brutal in its simplicity. No flourishes. No reverence. Remove all unverified relics from public display. Cease the sale of indulgences. Redirect tithe surplus to Astra Militarum logistics. Disband the order of penitent choirs in this diocese. Preserve pilgrimage rites where they maintain civic order. Eliminate liturgies that promote self-destruction as virtue. Cithrin stared. His mind struggled to categorize what he was seeing. It read like an administratum audit wearing a priest's skin. It read like someone who understood that faith could keep a world from tearing itself apart, and also understood that too much faith could become a blade turned inward. He looked up, hands shaking. This is heresy. The custodian stepped forward and the room seemed to shrink around the sound of his boots. He leaned down just enough that his helm's eye lenses caught Cithrin's reflection. A fat man in gold, suddenly small. This is the Emperor, the custodian said. Cithrin opened his mouth. No words came. Outside, in the basilica proper, thousands of pilgrims sang hymns to a god they had never seen. Inside, a cardinal realized that the god had opened his eyes. In the warp, time did not behave. It folded. It repeated. It laughed at clocks and made mockery of human certainty. A ship could spend minutes in the sea and emerge to find months had passed. Or the reverse. Or both, if the warp felt poetic. Tonight, something in the sea paused long enough to notice that its favorite prey had changed. A shoal of Daemons drifted along a current of terror, following the scent of an Imperial fleet that moved like a wounded animal through the dark. The Daemons were not uniform. They never were. One was a tall silhouette with too many joints, its limbs bending like broken promises. Another was a bloated thing that rolled through the immaterial tides, laughing through a mouth that opened in its belly. Another was only a face, beautiful and hungry, floating like a mask, drawing near because it enjoyed the taste of longing. They approached the fleet's path with the lazy confidence of predators that had never been punished for feeding. Then the light touched them. It was not flame. It was not lightning. It did not roar with the theatrical violence of witchfire. It was clean, pale radiance that carried the weight of a single, unmoving decision. The tall silhouette jerked as if hooked. Its joints seized. Its laughter turned to a strangled hiss. The bloated thing convulsed, belly-mouth gagging, its mirth collapsing into panic. The beautiful face twisted, features sharpening into something terrified and furious. The light did not burn them in the way Daemons expected. It did something worse. It defined them. It stripped away the indulgent chaos of their forms and forced them into the shape of what they were, parasitic thoughts given teeth. Under that scrutiny, they could not hold. The tall silhouette cracked, its outline fracturing into shards that dissolved into motes. The bloated thing ruptured, spilling not gore, but a spray of half-formed emotions that evaporated under the beam. The beautiful face screamed, soundless in the warp, then unraveled like cloth, pulled apart by unseen hands. The shoals scattered, fleeing into darker currents. Some were not fast enough. The light followed with patient certainty. Far away, in the material realm, Elira Noctis gasped and felt her third eye sting as if rubbed with salt. She tasted something she had never tasted in warp travel before. The warp's fear. Not fear of humans. Not fear of guns or prayers. Fear of being denied. Elira's attendants clung to her, sobbing. One whispered, "Emperor, preserve us," over and over, as if repetition could build a wall. Elira swallowed and whispered back, "Not a prayer, but a fact." "He is not preserving," she said. "He is correcting." The ship's engines sang. The Geller field held. The fleet slid through a corridor that, for once, did not feel like a gamble. In the sea, the Daemons learned a new sensation. Limit. Belisarius arrived without ceremony, which was how he signaled respect. Roboute stood in an antechamber off the strategium where paper maps still hung like stubborn relics. He liked those maps. They were honest about their limitations. They did not pretend the galaxy could be reduced to glowing icons. Belisarius entered with the soft whir of augmetics and the faint scent of machine oil. His red robes brushed the floor like spilled blood. His lenses glittered in the candlelight, each reflecting a different slice of the room. Mechadendrites swayed behind him, tasting the air with sensor tips like a nest of curious serpents. Roboute did not sit. He had learned that sitting in the presence of men like Belisarius turned conversation into negotiation. Standing kept it closer to confrontation. "You felt it," Roboute said. Belisarius' Vox grill clicked. "I observed several anomalies in the noosphere," he replied, as if describing a weather report. "They correlate with the Astronomican's change in signal purity." Roboute watched him. "Do not dress it in mechanics. Speak plainly." "No." Belisarius paused, and for a moment something almost like amusement crept into the tilt of his head. "Plainly," he said. "Your father's mind is no longer fractured in the way it was." Roboute's fingers tightened on the hilt of his gladius, not drawing it, but acknowledging that his body still knew the language of violence better than the language of grief. "He spoke to me." Belisarius Mechadendrite stilled. "That is significant." Roboute's gaze hardened. "Do not pretend surprise. You always plan for the improbable." "Damn." Belisarius gave a sound that might have been a laugh filtered through machinery. "I plan for inevitabilities other men refuse to name," he said. "An awake emperor is one of them." Roboute leaned forward slightly. Candlelight cut shadows into his face, emphasizing the fatigue he kept hidden for his officers. "He called worship a mechanism," Roboute said. "He issued directives like a logistician." Belisarius' lenses glittered brighter. "Because worship is a mechanism," he said, and there was no mockery in it, only the certainty of a man who had disassembled faith and found the screws. Roboute's voice lowered. "He said I was made to hold." Belisarius' head tilted. "A Primarch is a tool," he said softly. "Not an insult, a truth." Roboute's eyes narrowed at the word. Primarch. His father's old projects. The gene-crafted suns built to conquer the stars. Roboute had once believed they were also meant to build. "And what does an awake emperor mean for your projects?" Roboute asked. "For the Primaris. For your forbidden work." "Dirty." Belisarius Mechadendrites resumed their slow, thoughtful movement. "It means," he said carefully, "that the tolerances will tighten. The age of creative necessity may end." Roboute studied him. "You fear punishment." Belisarius' voice came out almost gentle. "I do not fear punishment," he said. "I fear inefficiency. Punishment is merely a method. Inefficiency is death." Roboute exhaled through his nose. Outside the chamber, the ship's systems hummed with renewed steadiness. The warp felt, wrongly, less hostile. The sensation unsettled him more than any storm. "If word spreads," Roboute said, "the Imperium will erupt. The faithful will claim prophecy. The High Lords will panic. The traitors? The traitors will listen, Belisarius finished. And so will the Xenos. An emperor who acts is a different kind of threat than an emperor who merely endures. Roboute's gaze flicked to the wooden icon on the shelf. He told me to reduce superstition where it impedes function, he said, and the bitterness returned. How do I do that without tearing out the Imperium's heart? Belisarius' lenses narrowed. By remembering, he said, that the heart is not the same as the infection. Roboute held his stare. For a moment, the chamber felt like a small room in an ancient castle, where two men decided the fate of kingdoms with whispers and knives. Roboute spoke at last. I will not become his executioner. Belisarius' voice softened into something almost reverent. Then you will become his engineer, he said. And you may find that more frightening. On the world of Gathus V, the rain tasted of ash. The planet's skies had been black with smoke for months, stained by the fires of war and the exhaust of landing craft. The ground was churned into mud by tracked armor and marching boots, each step sinking into the soft rot of a world that had been used as a battlefield, long enough to forget what peace felt like. In a field hospital tent stitched together from canvas and desperation, men groaned and prayed. Some were missing arms, some legs, some pieces of soul that no medic could stitch back. Lanterns swung from poles, casting golden light over pallid faces. A chaplain moved among the wounded, pressing a small relic into hands that shook too hard to hold it. The relic was a fragment of bone in a silver cage. It might have been a saint. It might have been a lie. It did not matter. The men clung to it like a rope. Outside the tent, prime Archmage warriors stood watch. Their armor was a deep blue, streaked with rain and the grime of combat. The men of the Astra Militarum looked at them with a mixture of awe and resentment, the way starving peasants might look at knights who arrived too late. Yet when the Primarch soldiers walked the lines, the wounded quieted. Not because the giants were kind, but because their presence made the war feel winnable. A young guardsman lay on a stretcher near the tent's flap, eyes open but unfocused. He was no older than 17, skin stretched tight over cheekbones, lips pale. A medic had wrapped his torso in bandages already soaked through. Every breath was a wet struggle. The chaplain knelt beside him, holding the relic close. "The Emperor watches," he murmured. The boy's eyes flicked toward the chaplain. "Does he?" he rasped. "Or is that something you say so we don't scream?" The chaplain's jaw tightened. He had heard the question in many forms. In the beginning, he had answered with anger. Now he answered with tired honesty wrapped in faith. "He watches," he said, "even if we cannot always bear the gaze." Outside, thunder rolled. The rain intensified, drumming on canvas like 1,000 fingers. The boy's eyelids fluttered. His hand clenched weakly around the relic. Then the air changed. The chaplain paused, frowning. He felt a pressure behind his eyes. Not painful, not crushing. Like a presence stepping into the tent's doorway. The lantern flames steadied, their flicker smoothing as if the wind had stopped. The boy's breathing eased for a heartbeat. His eyes sharpened. He stared past the chaplain toward the tent flap. Beyond the canvas, the sky brightened. Not with sunlight, not with a break in the storm, but with a pale, clean glow that seemed to seep through smoke and cloud like a new law. The rain still fell. The war still existed, but the light made the world look briefly corrected. Outside, soldiers stepped into the mud and looked up. Their faces were streaked with rain and blood. Some crossed themselves. Some whispered prayers. Some simply stared, mouths open, as if they had forgotten how to speak. A Primarch warrior turned his helm toward the horizon and stood perfectly still. He looked less like a man and more like a statue watching a prophecy unfold. In the tent, the chaplain felt his throat tighten. He had preached the Emperor's watchfulness for decades. He had never felt it like this. Not as a comforting story, but as a precise weight that made his words feel suddenly accountable. The boy on the stretcher whispered, voice trembling. I can feel it." The chaplain swallowed, eyes still fixed on the pale glow beyond the flap. "So can I," he admitted. For a moment, in a muddy field hospital on a dying world, hope was no longer a story men told each other. It was a pressure in the air. The High Lord's chamber was designed to make men believe they mattered. It was all gilt and marble, a long table carved from black stone, the Aquila etched into every surface until the symbol became a texture rather than an emblem. Tapestries hung like curtains of history. Servitors moved silently with trays of parchment and ink, their eyes blank, their mouths sewn shut. Servo skulls drifted above the table, recording, watching, whispering with the soft rasp of quills. Tonight, the air was hot with argument. A woman in layered robes of administratum blue slapped a data slate down hard enough to make inkpots tremble. "The Crusade cannot sustain that rate of deployment," she snapped. "Not with warp routes unreliable. Not with—" A man in red ecclesiarchal vestments cut in, his fingers jeweled. "We cannot abandon the faithful worlds beyond the rift," he hissed. "It would be a betrayal of the Emperor's divine mandate." A third, a gaunt figure with the pallor of one who lived in sealed chambers, smiled thinly. "Mandate," he echoed. "Convenient word. You mean your authority?" "No." The argument spiraled, voices rising, pride and fear weaving together into a net. They had been doing this for centuries, powerful men and women bickering in a palace while the galaxy burned. They justified it with necessity. They called it governance. The chamber doors opened. Every voice died mid-syllable, as if a hand had closed around the room's throat. Trajann Valoris stepped into the chamber, and the illusion of the High Lord's power cracked like old plaster. He did not bring an army. He did not need one. A handful of custodes entered behind him, their gold armor catching the chamber's lamplight and making the High Lord's gilding look cheap. Their spears were held upright. Their helms were on. Their presence was the kind of authority that did not require permission. The High Lords stared, faces tightening with indignation and dread. They were used to the custodes as ornaments, silent watchers at ceremonies, golden statues that reminded everyone the Emperor still existed. They were not used to them walking into political chambers like lords into their own keep. The ecclesiarchal representative found his voice first, perhaps because faith made men bold when they should be quiet. "Captain General," he began, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "To what do we owe?" Trajann raised a hand. The gesture was the same as the one that had silenced Cithran. It cut through the room like a knife through silk. "The Emperor has issued directives," Trajann said. Silence thickened. The words hung heavy. One of the High Lords, an older man with a face like carved stone, laughed, a dry sound of disbelief. "The Emperor issues nothing," he said. "He endures. He—" Trajann's helm turned slightly toward him. Though his face was hidden, the man flinched as if stared at by a predator. "He is awake," Trajann said, and the room's temperature seemed to drop. The administratum woman's lips parted, then closed. Her eyes flicked toward the chamber's far wall, as if she could see through stone to the throne room and confirm the impossible. The gaunt High Lord, inquisitorial liaison by the look of him, leaned forward, eyes narrowing with sudden calculation. "If this is true," he said softly, "then protocol." "Protocol is a tool," Trajann cut in. "It is not a shield." He stepped closer to the table. The servo skulls drifted back, instinctively, as if machine spirits knew when to give space to something older than them. Trajann placed a single parchment on the black stone. No seals. No flourish. Only an Aquila stamped in plain wax. "You will read," Trajann said. "You will comply. You will not convene another meeting without my order." The High Lords stared at the parchment as if it were a serpent. Pride warred with survival on their faces. The ecclesiarchal representative's fingers trembled. The administratum woman's jaw worked, muscles clenching. The old man who had laughed leaned back slowly, as if the chair had turned into a blade. "This is a coup," someone whispered, voice thin. Trajann's voice remained flat, almost bored. "This is obedience," he said. Behind him, the Custodes did not move. In the silence, the High Lords felt something they had not felt in their entire political careers: accountability. Illyra Noctis wanted to laugh. She wanted to laugh the way men laughed, when a sword finally slid into a scabbard after a night of fighting. She wanted to laugh because the root she was holding in her mind, this impossible thread through the warp, was stable. It stayed where she put it. It did not twist into a noose when she looked away. Instead, she cried. The tears came without warning, hot on her cheeks, slipping under the edges of her veil. Her third eye burned with pale light as it stared into the sea. The Astronomican's beam cut through the storm not like a torch, but like a law written in radiance. Her attendants whispered prayers, voices shaking. One of them, a boy with delicate fingers and a scar down his throat, fell to his knees and pressed his forehead to the salt-carved floor. "Emperor, preserve us," he sobbed. Illyra's lips pulled back from her teeth. "He is not preserving," she said again, harsher now. "He is measuring." In the warp, shapes moved at the edge of the ship's path. Not Daemons this time, not the eager predators that swam toward fear. These were larger presences, distant and patient, like whales that had learned to think. Illyra sensed them as she might sense weather, the deep pressure shifts that preceded catastrophe. They had watched humanity for millennia, feeding on it, shaping it, laughing at its attempts to impose order on chaos. Now the light touched their currents, and they slowed. Illyra felt one of them turn its attention toward the beacon. She could not see its form, not fully. Her mind refused to hold it, but she felt its surprise as a ripple through the sea. She felt its irritation. And then, something like caution. The Astronomican did not chase it. It did not flare and challenge. It simply remained, clean and constant, refusing to be moved. Illyra's breath hitched. The power of it made her stomach twist. The warp had always been a place of negotiation, of bargains with hunger. Navigators did not command the sea. They coaxed it, bribed it with fear and prayer and sacrifice. This was command. Her fingers tightened on the silver chains. The metal bit into her skin, reminding her she was a mortal woman standing at the edge of infinity. She wanted to close her third eye and weep like a child. She wanted to run to the ship's chapel and kneel until her knees bled. Instead, she held the root. The ship's engines throbbed. The Geller field's hum was steady. Outside, the warp churned with its usual filth, but the corridor they traveled was calmer. Still dangerous, still insane, but shaped. Illyra's tears slowed. She swallowed, tasting salt and smoke. If the Emperor could do this, if he could impose this kind of will on the sea, then the Imperium would change. Not gradually, like rot turning a beam to dust. Quickly, violently, like a castle's foundation being ripped out and replaced while the towers still stood. Her attendants whispered her name. Illyra did not respond. She kept her third eye open and stared into the light, and in that light she felt, for the first time, the Emperor's attention slide across her like a knife passing over a throat, assessing, deciding, moving on. She survived the gaze. That did not comfort her. It meant she was useful. Reliquary vault smelled like old perfume and mold. It lay beneath the basilica, hidden behind a wall that only moved when a hymn was sung in the correct key. The priests who maintained it spoke of it in reverent whispers, as if secrecy itself was holiness. Here, they said, rested the true bones of saints, the shards of swords that had slain Daemons, the tears of martyrs caught in crystal. Trajann stepped into the vault and saw immediately what it really was. A treasury. Silver coffers stacked like bricks. Glass cases filled with bones of uncertain origin. Sealed jars of wax and hair and teeth. Scrolls cataloging miracles, with the careful attention of merchants. Priests in gold and white robes stood clustered near the far wall, hands clasped, faces pale. Behind them, armed guards shifted uneasily, their fingers twitching near triggers. The guards were not fools. They knew the custodes in the doorway were not here to be negotiated with. Trajann's armor made almost no sound as he walked. That was always the strangest part. So much mass moving with such quiet control. He stopped before the largest glass case, where a skeleton lay posed in velvet. A plaque identified it as Saint Hallex, martyr of the 3rd century of the Imperium. The skull's teeth were too perfect. He looked at the priests. "Open the ledgers," he said. A priest, thin, with a beard oiled into careful curls, swallowed hard. "Honored Lord," he began, voice trembling with practiced humility. "These relics are sacred. Only the Ecclesiarchy." Trajann raised the parchment with the plain Aquila seal. The priest's words died. Trajann did not need to explain. The seal did not need to boast. It simply existed, and in its existence was the unspoken truth. The emperors had entered the world again, and all other authorities were suddenly suspect. The priest's hands shook as he gestured to an acolyte. The acolyte hurried to a side table and opened a massive ledger bound in human skin. The pages were covered in tight script, entries listing donations, pilgrimage tithes, the sale of blessings. Trajann read without emotion. The numbers were obscene. He turned the page. Read again. Turned again. His mind categorized, measured, calculated. Every transaction was a vein. Every indulgence a parasite. When he looked up, the priests flinched as if struck. "This vault will be emptied," Trajann said. "Verified relics will be cataloged and transferred to secure storage. Unverified relics will be destroyed. Funds will be redistributed to the Crusade's logistical arteries." The bearded priest's mouth opened in horror. "Destroyed?" he choked. "But the faithful." Trajann's helm turned toward him. "The faithful will endure," he said. "They have endured lies before." Another priest, older, eyes red-rimmed, stepped forward, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. "This is sacrilege," he whispered, voice breaking. "The saints." Trajann's voice remained level. "The Emperor has no need of your saints," he said. "He has need of functioning supply lines." The old priest's eyes widened. For a heartbeat, the man looked like he might throw himself at Trajann, claws out, driven by desperation and doctrine. Then the silent sister stepped into view behind Trajann, her expression empty. The priest's courage crumpled. He fell to his knees, sobbing. Trajann watched him with something close to pity, though it was more accurate to call it recognition. These men had built their lives on a story. Now the story had turned its head and looked at them with cold, surgical clarity. Trajann gestured, and custodians moved into the vault like gold shadows, beginning the work of cataloging. They handled relics the way soldiers handled explosives, carefully, without reverence. One custodian paused beside the skeleton of Saint Hallex, and with a gloved finger, tapped the skull's teeth. The sound was wrong. Too dense. Too synthetic. Trajann's jaw tightened. A lie. He had expected them. He had still hoped, foolishly, that the lies were fewer. He turned away from the glass case and walked deeper into the vault, toward the heart of the Ecclesiarchy's hidden wealth. Above them, in the basilica, pilgrims sang praises. Below them, the Emperor's knives dismantled a kingdom built on bones. The fleet translated into the warp with the familiar violence of reality tearing. Roboute stood on the command deck, hands clasped behind his back, watching the void through layered viewports thick enough to stop macro shells. Outside was nothing but darkness and the faint shimmer of the Geller field, an invisible skin holding back the sea. The command deck was crowded with officers who pretended not to be afraid. They spoke in clipped tones. They called out readings. They watched gauges and runes and the twitching hands of servitors plugged into systems like veins in the flesh. Roboute felt their fear anyway. It was a taste in the air, a faint sourness behind incense. He did not blame them. Warp travel had become worse since the Great Rift. Every jump was a prayer. A navigator's attendant stood near the edge of the deck, veiled, hands clasped. She trembled as if resisting the urge to run. Behind her, the navigator retinue murmured litanies, their voices weaving a thin, trembling thread of ritual. The ship's lights dimmed in the moment of transition. The hum of engines changed pitch. The void outside the viewports became wrong. Not empty, but full of motion that did not obey physics. Colors seeped through the darkness like bruises. Shadows pressed against the Geller field as if curious. Roboute had expected the usual, the sense of a storm pressing at the walls, the faint distant screaming that always lurked at the edge of hearing when the warp was near. Instead, there was a corridor. Not a calm sea. Not... nah. But a corridor carved through the madness, a path that held its shape with unnerving discipline. The colors outside seemed arranged, as Elira had said. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if the ship's passage offended them. A murmur ran through the deck. An officer crossed himself. Another whispered a prayer. A servitor's augmetic hand paused mid-motion, then resumed as if corrected. Roboute stared into the warp and felt the Emperor's presence like a cold hand on the back of his neck. It was not comforting. It did not cradle his mind like a father's reassurance. It pressed him forward the way a commander's palm might press a soldier toward a breach. He thought of the message: stabilize the species, consolidate, reduce redundancy, preserve morale where useful. It sounded like logistics. But in the warp's pale corridor, he understood the deeper implication. If the Emperor could carve corridors through hell, then the Imperium's suffering was no longer only endurance. It was now chosen, directed, shaped. Roboute's stomach twisted. He had wanted his father awake for so long, wanted guidance, clarity, an end to the mad improvisation of survival. Now that wakefulness brushed the galaxy, Roboute felt how sharp it was, how devoid of sentiment, how willing to sacrifice anything that did not serve the species' continuation. A Vox officer called out, voice breaking slightly. Route stability at 98%, Lord. 98. In the warp.I. It was absurd. Roboute's gaze slid to the navigator's attendant. Her eyes were wide behind the veil, shining with tears. She looked like a woman who had just seen a god and realized gods did not smile. Roboute turned back to the viewport. In the wrong light of the warp, his reflection stared back at him, tall, armored, composed, eyes dark with exhaustion. He remembered being a prime arc in the Great Crusade built to conquer. He remembered the dream of rational empire. He remembered the Emperor's refusal to tolerate religion, superstition, stagnation. Now he commanded an Imperium that worshipped his father as a god, and the god had opened his eyes and spoken like an auditor. Roboute breathed in the incense-heavy air and tasted ash. "We continue," he said, because there was nothing else to say. Outside, the pale corridor held. In the sea, something watched the fleet pass and chose not to feed, because feeding had become, for once, dangerous. Inquisitor Kyria Draconius had built her life on doors that never opened. Her vault was buried under layers of bureaucracy, wards, and lies. The entrance was disguised as a supply closet in an administratum sub-level. The hallway leading to it was lined with sensor arrays that could taste genetic code in the air. The final lock required 3 separate seals and a prayer spoken in a dead language. Kyria stood among shelves of parchment and data slate stacks, the air dry and cold to preserve secrets. Her coat was black, fitted, lined with hidden pockets. Silver sigils hung at her throat, the Inquisition's eye, flanked by skulls, a Rosarius that pulsed faintly with stored power. Her eyes were sharp, her hair pulled back tight, her jaw set with the kind of certainty that came from surviving her own order. She had been reading a file when the alarms did not go off. That was the first sign something had changed. The second sign was the door opening without protest. Kyria's hand moved to her sidearm. The action was smooth, practiced. She did not draw. Drawing too early was a confession of fear, but her fingers rested on the grip, ready. The door swung wide. Trajann Valoris stepped in. Kyria's heart did not race. She had stared down cult leaders and rogue psychers and alien envoys. She had watched worlds burn and signed the orders. She had made peace with the idea that one day her own order might kill her. But the Custodes were different. They were not politics. They were myth, made metal. Trajann's armor filled the doorway with gold and quiet menace. Custodians stood behind him like a wall. Their spears' tips gleamed in the vault's cold light. Kyria's lips tightened. "Captain General," she said evenly. She kept her voice respectful. "Respect cost nothing. This vault is Inquisition property." Trajann's helm turned slightly, the movement controlled. "No," he said. "It is Imperial property." Kyria's nostrils flared. "The Inquisition answers only to the Emperor." A pause. Then Trajann stepped forward, and the vault seemed to tighten around his presence. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Then you will answer," he said. Kyria's fingers tightened on her weapon grip. "If you are here to threaten me, you waste your time," she said. "I have had threats for breakfast." Trajann stopped a few paces away, close enough that Kyria could see the faint scratches on his armor. Marks of time and battle, evidence that even gold could be scarred. "I am not here to threaten," he said. "I am here to audit." Kyria's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Audit," she repeated, tasting the absurdity. "You sound like an administratum clerk." Trajann's voice remained flat. "The Emperor sounds like an administratum clerk," he said, and the words hit the vault like a bell tolling. Kyria froze, not outwardly but inside. She kept her face still. "That is an unusual statement." Trajann's helm did not tilt. "He is awake," he said again, and Kyria felt in the deepest place she kept her fear, a shift. Awake. If it was true, it changed everything. If it was not true, then it was a coup of unprecedented scale. Kyria's mind raced, categorizing possibilities. Her lips parted. "If he is awake," she said carefully, "then I demand." Trajann raised a hand. The gesture silenced not only Kyria's words, but the part of her that wanted to argue. The air seemed to press down, a subtle pressure that was not physical. Kyria's Belisarius pulsed once as if startled. Trajann spoke, and his voice carried something new. Not his authority, but the echo of something older. "Seize internal predation," Trajann said. "Eliminate redundant purges. Redirect resources to external war. Preserve counter-corruption apparatus. Excise vanity." Kyria stared. The words were not his style. They were too clean. Too inhumanly efficient. Her throat tightened. "That is the Emperor's directive?" Trajann nodded once. Kyria's eyes flicked to the shelves around them. Files on traitor lineages. Names of governors bribed. Records of saintly fraud. Evidence that could topple planets. The Inquisition's power was built on these secrets. She swallowed. "If I comply," she said, voice low, "I weaken my order." Trajann stepped closer, and Kyria felt the edge of his presence like a blade against her mind. "If you refuse," he said, "you weaken the species." Kyria's hand left her weapon. Slowly, deliberately. She straightened, shoulders squaring. "What do you want?" she asked. Trajann extended a gloved hand, not in supplication, but in expectation. "The ledgers," he said. "The blacklists. The operations schedules. The names." Nah. Kyria's jaw clenched. She had killed for less than this information. She had tortured for less. She had lied to allies and enemies alike because secrecy kept humanity alive. Now secrecy had been deemed noise. She took a breath. "You will find corruption," she said as if warning him. Trajann's helm turned slightly, and for a moment Kyria imagined she could see his eyes behind the lenses. Cold, steady, unblinking. "I expect it," he said. "That is why I am here." Kyria reached for the first file and placed it in Trajann's hand. The paper felt heavier than it should have. In the vault, secrets began to bleed into light. Mara had lived her life in absence. The Sisters of Silence did not hear the warp the way psychers did. They were holes in its fabric, voids where its noise died. To walk among them was to feel the universe stop whispering. Some found it comforting. Most found it unbearable, like standing in a room where all the air had been sucked out. Amara stood in the outer antechamber of the throne room, hands folded, posture perfect. Gray robes hung from her shoulders like plain cloth in a palace that loved ornament. Her shaved scalp caught the cold light of lumen strips. Her eyes were steady, hard. She had watched thousands of psychers come and go. They arrived in chains. They left as ash. That was the bargain Terra made every day. A river of mines fed into the machine so that the Imperium could keep moving. The Sisters had always stood at the edge of that bargain, silent witnesses to an atrocity that was also survival. Tonight, the river changed. A line of psyker acolytes emerged from the throne's inner sanctum escorted by tech priests and custodes. They should not have been emerging. They should have been carried out on stretchers, dead-eyed, their souls burned down to keep the throne's hunger satisfied. Instead, they walked, staggering, pale, shaking like reeds, but alive. Amara watched them with an expression that did not change. Yet inside her void there was a disturbance, not emotion, but a shift in the shape of reality. The air around the psychers felt cleaner, less soaked in despair. One of them, a boy with bruises around his wrists from chains, lifted his head and looked toward Amara. His eyes were clear. He mouthed words, though Amara could not hear them. She read lips easily. Silence made you attentive. "Thank you," he mouthed. Amara did not respond. She could not in the way he wanted. The Sisters' vow of silence was not just discipline, it was identity. To speak would be to become something else. But she watched him pass and wondered what it meant. The throne's hunger had never been questioned openly. Even among the custodes, it was accepted as necessity. The Emperor endured. Therefore, the sacrifice endured. Now, some were being spared. The implication was not mercy. It was efficiency. The Emperor, coherent, would not waste what could be used again. He would not burn souls needlessly if the machine could be regulated. Amara's gaze flicked to the sealed doors of the inner chamber. Behind them, the golden throne hummed with new precision, its ancient mechanisms cycling in patterns that felt less like desperate improvisation and more like controlled operation. Amara felt the Emperor's presence as a pressure that did not slide into her void, because nothing could but pressed against it, outlining her absence like a finger tracing the edge of a knife. She did not hear a voice. She did not receive words. Yet she felt something she had never felt in the palace. Recognition, as if the Emperor's will had brushed past her null and, instead of recoiling, had noted it as useful. Amara's throat tightened. Not with fear, with the strange weight of being seen by something that had not truly looked at anyone in 10,000 years. The psychers were led away. Tech priests muttered. Custodes watched. The palace continued its endless labor. But Amara stood in the antechamber and understood that the daily sacrifice had changed shape. The Emperor was still fed. He had simply stopped feeding blindly. The ship's chapel was never empty, but it could be quiet. Roboute entered when the bells had finished their cycle and the last of the crew had drifted out, heads bowed, hands stained with oil and ink and the residue of war. The chapel smelled of wax and old metal. Skulls lined the walls in neat rows, each one etched with a name or a prayer or a warning. Tapestries hung from the vaulted ceiling depicting the Emperor as a radiant monarch, his face unscarred by the throne's suffering, his eyes full of gentle judgment. Roboute hated the tapestries. He hated them the way a man hated a flattering portrait painted over his scars. He walked between rows of benches, boots echoing softly. His armor was dulled, scratched, the blue deep as bruised night. He did not wear his helm. He needed to feel the air on his face, to remind himself he was still a man and not merely a symbol. At the chapel's front stood a statue of the emperor carved from white stone, towering, serene. The sculptor had given him a crown and a sword, had made him look like a king from some feudal myth. Roboute stared up at the statue and felt something like nausea. The emperor he had known had been a man who spoke of reason and unity, a man who had despised religion, a man who had used myth as a tool and expected his sons to outgrow it. This statue was a god. Roboute's hand brushed against a string of prayer beads someone had left on a bench. The beads were worn smooth, the cord frayed. He lifted them, letting them slide through his fingers. He thought of the boy on Gathis V clinging to a relic. He thought of the chaplain whispering comfort. He thought of how faith held the Imperium together like mortar and crumbling stone. The Emperor's message echoed in his mind. Worship is a mechanism. Roboute's jaw tightened. He could not decide whether the statement was cruel or simply honest. He turned his gaze away from the statue and looked at the chapel's side alcove, where a stained glass window depicted the Horus Heresy as a simple morality tale. Traitors cast down, loyalists triumphant, the Emperor shining in victory. The reality had been blood and betrayal, and loss so deep it had turned the galaxy inside out. Roboute closed his eyes. He felt the Emperor's presence again, not as a voice, not as words, but as a tension sliding across him with surgical calm. It did not comfort him. It did not condemn him. It assessed him the way one assessed a blade before battle. Sharpness, durability, flaws. Roboute opened his eyes and stared into the chapel's flickering candlelight. "I will not become a tyrant," he said aloud, voice low, as if the skulls might repeat his words to the ship. "I will not become an executioner for your efficiency." The air did not respond. The candles did not flare. The Emperor did not speak. Roboute's throat tightened. He hated the silence more than he hated the voice. At least the voice had been real. He set the prayer beads down carefully, as if placing a weapon. Then he turned and walked back down the aisle. At the chapel doors, he paused and glanced back one last time at the Emperor's statue. In the flicker of candlelight, the stone face looked almost alive. Roboute thought of the throne room, of the skeletal reality, of the brutal machine holding a will that had just become coherent again. The statue was a lie, but the lie kept men marching. Roboute pushed the doors open and stepped into the ship's corridor, where war waited like weather. Trajann entered the inner sanctum without his helm. He did not do it for humility. He did it because he had learned over millennia that the truth of the throne could not be filtered. To look at it through lenses was to pretend it could be mediated. The sanctum was a cathedral of machinery. Cables as thick as trees ran from the throne into the walls, disappearing into the palace's depths like roots. Sigils were etched into every surface, not decorative but functional, wards and circuits married into one language. The air hummed with power. It tasted of ozone and incense and something metallic that might have been old blood. The Emperor sat on the throne, as always. Flesh, what remained of it, was pulled tight over bone. The face was not serene. It was not kind. It was the face of a man who had been sacrificed to keep an empire alive. The eyes were open, and Trajann's breath caught before he could stop it. They were not human eyes. Not anymore. They were wells of light and shadow, holding something vast behind them. Trajann dropped to one knee. Not in worship, in acknowledgement of command. The tech priests around the sanctum had frozen mid-chant, their mouths half open, their augmetic hands hovering over consoles. The Sisters of Silence stood like pale statues, their void presence making the air feel stripped bare. A line of psyker acolytes waited on a gantry, chains loose now, their faces slack with stunned survival. The throne's hum changed, subtle as a breath. Trajann felt the Emperor's attention settle on him like a weight that did not crush, but pinned him in place. Words formed in Trajann's mind. Not loud. Not dramatic. Simply present, as if they had always been there and Trajann had only just learned to read them. Trajann.u. Trajann's throat tightened. He had been named by the Emperor before, centuries ago, in a communion so faint he had thought it a dream. This was not faint. You will act beyond terra. Trajann lifted his head slightly. Yes, he said. The word came out rough. He did not bother to hide the emotion. It was not weakness. It was reality. Preserve terra. Preserve the beacon. Preserve the core. Trajann's mind raced, parsing. Preserve the core. That meant what counted as core? The throne. The Astronomican. The Administratum? The Ecclesiarchy? The High Lords? The Emperor answered before Trajann could ask, as if the question had been anticipated centuries ago. Preserve function. Excise ornament. Trajann swallowed. He thought of reliquary vaults, indulgence markets, political feasts held while worlds died. Ornament was half the Imperium. Excising it would be like cutting away fat from an old beast. Necessary. But the beast would scream. You will not seek praise. Trajann's jaw tightened. I do not, he said. A pause. Then the Emperor's attention sharpened. You will not become a new priesthood. Trajann felt the implication like a blow. The Custodes had always been revered. In this age, they were almost mythic. If they began to act openly, the people would make them saints. The Ecclesiarchy would drape them in doctrine. The Imperium would warp their purpose into symbol. Trajann understood. We will be invisible, he said. The emperors were pressed, approving, not emotionally, but structurally, like a cog sliding into place. Then came the final directive, the one that made Trajann's engineered heart tighten. If resistance threatens species stability, remove it. Trajann's fingers curled against the stone floor. Even if, he began. Even if. The answer was immediate, merciless. Species first. Trajann bowed his head. He had spent 10,000 years guarding the Emperor's life at the cost of countless others. He had called it duty. Now duty had been named in its true form. Triaging humanity. Trajann rose, slower than usual, because standing felt like stepping into a new world. The Emperor's gaze did not follow him as he backed away. It was already elsewhere, stretching through the warp, shaping corridors, pressing against institutions, measuring, correcting. Trajann turned and left the inner sanctum. Behind him, the throne's hum continued, steady, precise, controlled. The Emperor did not smile. He did not need to. Roboute returned to the strategium before dawn cycle. The ship's chronometers marked time in a dozen ways, some mechanical, some ritual. On the command deck, officers worked in shifts that blurred into one another, driven by exhaustion and necessity. The fleet continued through the warp corridor with unnatural steadiness. Reports came in, reduced turbulence, fewer contact anomalies, smoother translation points. Men began to whisper of miracles. Roboute did not correct them. Not yet. He stood at the strategium table, looking down at ledgers and maps. Not the hololith this time. Paper, ink, numbers. Supply lines. Fuel reserves. Ammunition counts. Planetary ties. The skeleton of empire laid bare. Belisarius stood to one side, silent, lenses glittering. Elira's retinue waited in the shadows near the strategium's entrance, veils trembling like moth wings. An astropath knelt near the table, head bowed, blood dried on his lips. He had been spared again. That alone told Roboute the Emperor's efficiency was not limited to machines. Roboute held a parchment between his fingers. Plain wax seal. Aquila. No flourish. The Emperor's directive, carried through minds and machines, now made tangible. Roboute read it again, though he knew every line by heart. Consolidate. End redundant. Offensives. Retrieve what can be held. Write off what cannot. Redirect resources to core worlds and key corridors. Do not expand. Stabilize. His throat tightened on the fourth line. Write off what cannot. He saw faces when he read it. Not numbers. Faces. Worlds beyond the rift, screaming into void, their prayers bouncing off warpstorm walls. Cities fighting cults with kitchen knives. Governors begging for reinforcements that would never come. Children born under red skies, taught the Emperor's name before they learned their own. He had come back to save the Imperium. Now the Emperor was telling him to let parts of it die. Roboute's jaw clenched. He looked up at the officers gathered nearby. They watched him the way men watched a lord about to speak sentence. Some looked hopeful. Some looked afraid. All looked desperate for certainty. Roboute could not give them comfort. Comfort was another kind of lie. He set the parchment down on the table. "We adjust our objectives," Roboute said. An admiral swallowed. "Lord Regent, the Crusade." "We continue," Roboute said, and felt the word taste like iron. "But not as conquest, as consolidation. We secure corridors. We fortify supply arteries. We reinforce worlds that can be held and that matter for species stability." A general's face tightened. "And the others?" Roboute did not look away. "We stop pretending we can save everyone," he said. The room's air seemed to thin. A servo skull drifted closer, its quills scratching frantic notes. Belisarius mechadendrites twitched, subtle, as if pleased. Elira's attendant made a small sound, half sob, half prayer. Roboute continued. "We will not announce this as abandonment," he said. "We will frame it as strategic redeployment. We will preserve morale where it is useful. We will not invite panic." The Admiral's hands tightened on the table edge. "The faithful will call it betrayal." Roboute's eyes hardened. "The faithful will call anything betrayal that does not match their stories," he said. "We do not have the luxury of matching stories. We have the luxury of surviving." "Naughty. Do." He felt it then, the Emperor's attention sliding across him again, cold and precise. Not approval. Not affection. Simply alignment. A tool being set in the correct position. Roboute's stomach churned. He turned toward the astropath. "Send to Terra," he ordered. "To Trajann." The astropath flinched, then bowed his head. "Yes, Lord." Roboute spoke the message himself, because some words were too heavy to trust to another mouth. "We comply," he said, voice steady. "We stabilize. We consolidate. We become what is necessary." "Dan." He paused, tasting the last thought before he spoke it. "And we pray," he added quietly. "That necessity does not make monsters of us." No one answered. The ship hummed. The warp corridor held. The Astronomican's clean light cut through the sea like a blade. Roboute looked down at the Aquila seal on the parchment and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water poured over his head, that the Emperor's awakening was not the return of a father. It was the return of a force. And forces did not care who they crushed, so long as the structure held.